Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/BrianEDenton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 63. Chapter 63. On our right flank, commanded by Bagration, at 9 o'clock the battle had not yet begun. Not wishing to agree to Dolgorukov's demand to commence the action, and wishing to avert responsibility from himself, Prince Bagration proposed to Dolgorukov to send to inquire of the commander-in-chief. Bagration knew that as the distance between the two flanks was more than 6 miles, even if the messenger were not killed, which he very likely would be, and found the commander-in-chief, which would be very difficult, he would not be able to get back before evening. Bagration cast his large, expressionless, sleepy eyes round his suite, and the boyish face of Rostov, breathless with excitement and hope, was the first to catch his eye. He sent him. "And if I should meet His Majesty before I meet the Commander-in-Chief, Your Excellency?" said Rostov, with his hand to his cap. "You can give the message to His Majesty," said Dolgorukov, hurriedly interrupting Bagration. On being relieved from picket duty, Rostov had managed to get a few hours' sleep before morning, and felt cheerful, bold, and resolute, with elasticity of movement, faith in his good fortune, and generally in that state of mind which makes everything seem possible, pleasant, and easy. All his wishes were being fulfilled that morning. There was to be a general engagement in which he was taking part. More than that, he was orderly to the bravest general, and still more, he was going with a message to Kutuzov, perhaps even to the sovereign himself. The morning was bright. He had a good horse under him, and his heart was full of joy and happiness. On receiving the order, he gave his horse to rein and galloped along the line. At first he rode along the line of Bagration's troops, which had not yet advanced into action, but were standing motionless. Then he came to the region occupied by Uvarov's cavalry, and here he noticed a stir and signs of preparation for battle. Having passed Uvarov's cavalry, he clearly heard the sound of cannon and musketry ahead of him. The firing grew louder and louder. In the fresh morning air were now heard not 2 or 3 musket shots at irregular intervals as before, followed by 1 or 2 cannon shots, but a roll of volley of musketry from the slopes of the hill before Pratzen, interrupted by such frequent reports of cannon that sometimes several of them were not separated from one another, but merged into a general roar. He could see puffs of musketry smoke that seemed to chase one another down the hillsides, and clouds of cannon smoke rolling, spreading, and mingling with one another. He could also, by the gleam of bayonets visible through the smoke, make out moving masses of infantry and narrow lines of artillery with green caissons. Rostov stopped his horse for a moment on the hillock to see what was going on, but strain his attention as he would, he could not understand or make out anything of what was happening. There in the smoke, men of some sort were moving about. In front and behind moved lines of troops, but why, whither, and who they were, it was impossible to make out. These sights and sounds had no depressing or intimidating effect on him. On the contrary, they stimulated his energy and determination. Go on, give it to them!" he mentally exclaimed at these sounds, and again proceeded to gallop along the line, penetrating farther and farther into the region where the army was already in action. "How will it be there I don't know, but all will be well," thought Rostov. After passing some Austrian troops, he noticed that the next part of the line, the Guards, was already in action. So much the better. I shall see it close, he thought. He was riding almost along the front line. A handful of men came galloping toward him. They were of our Uhlans, who with disordered ranks were returning from the attack. Rostov got out of their way, involuntarily noticed that one of them was bleeding, and galloped on. That is no business of mine, he thought. He had not ridden many hundred yards after that before he saw to his left, across the whole width of the field, an enormous mass of cavalry in brilliant white uniforms, mounted on black horses, trotting straight toward him and across his path. Rostov put his horse to full gallop to get out of the way of these men, and he would have got clear had they continued at the same speed, but they kept increasing their pace, so that some of the horses were already galloping. Rostov heard the thud of their hooves and the jingle of their weapons, and saw their horses, their figures, and even their faces more and more distinctly. They were our horse guards, advancing to attack the French cavalry that was coming to meet them. The horse guards were galloping, but still holding in their horses. Rostov could already see their faces and heard the command, "Charge!" shouted by an officer who was urging his thoroughbred to full speed. Rostov, fearing to be crushed or swept away into the attack on the French, galloped along the front as hard as his horse could go, but still was not in time to avoid them. The last of the horse guards, a huge pock-marked fellow, frowned angrily on seeing Rostov before him, with whom he would inevitably collide. This guardsman would certainly have bowled Rostov and his Bedouin over. Rostov felt himself quite tiny and weak compared to these gigantic men and horses, had it not occurred to Rostov to flourish his whip before the eyes of the guardsman's horse. The heavy black horse, 16 hands high, shied, throwing back its ears. But the pock-marked guardsman drove his huge spurs in violently, and the horse, flourishing its tail and extending its neck, galloped on yet faster. Hardly had the horse guards passed before Rostov, he heard them shout, "Hurrah!" and looking back, saw their foremost ranks were mixed up with some foreign cavalry with red epaulets, probably French. He could see nothing more, for immediately afterwards cannon began firing from somewhere, and smoke enveloped everything. At that moment, as the horse guards, having passed him, disappeared into the smoke, Rostov hesitated whether to gallop after them or to go where he was sent. This was the brilliant charge of the horse guards that amazed the French themselves. Rostov was horrified to hear later of all that mass of huge and handsome men, of all those brilliant rich youths, officers, and cadets who had galloped past him on their 1,000-ruble horses. Only 18 were left after the charge. Why should I envy them? My chance is not lost, and maybe I shall see the Emperor immediately, thought Rostov, and galloped on. When he came level with the foot guards, he noticed that about them and around them cannonballs were flying, of which he was aware not so much because he heard their sound, as because he saw uneasiness on the soldiers' faces and unnatural warlike solemnity on those of the officers. Passing behind one of the lines of a regiment of foot guards, he heard a voice calling to him. "Rostov!" "What?" he answered, not recognizing Boris. "I say, we've been in the front line. Our regiment attacked," said Boris, with a happy smile, seen on the faces of young men who have been under fire for the first time. Rostov stopped. "Have you?" he said. "Well, how did it go?" "We drove them back," said Boris with animation, growing talkative. "Can you imagine it?" And he began describing how the guards, having taken up their position and seeing troops before them, thought they were Austrians, and all at once discovered from the cannonballs discharged by those troops that they were themselves in the front line and had unexpectedly to go into action. Rostov, without hearing Boris to the end, spurred his horse. "Where are you off to?" asked Boris. "With a message to His Majesty." "There he is," said Boris, thinking Rostov had said His Highness, and pointing to the Grand Duke, who with his high shoulders and frowning brows stood 100 paces away from them in the helmet and horse guard's jacket, shouting something to a pale, white-uniformed Austrian officer. "But that's the Grand Duke, and I want the Commander-in-Chief or the Emperor," thought Rostov, and was about to spur his horse. "Count! Count!" shouted Berg, who ran up from the other side as eager as Boris. "Count, I'm wounded in my right hand." And he showed his bleeding hand with a handkerchief tied round it. "And I remained at the front. I held my sword in my left hand, Count. All our family, the von Bergs, have been knights." He said something more, but Rostov did not wait to hear it and rode away. Having passed the guards and traversed an empty space, Rostov, To avoid again getting in front of the front line as he had done when the horse guards charged, followed the line of reserves, going far round the place where the hottest musket fire and cannonade was heard. Suddenly he heard musket fire quite close in front of him, and behind our troops, where he could never have expected the enemy to be. What can it be? He thought. The enemy in the rear of our army? Impossible. And suddenly he was seized by a panic of fear for himself, and for the issue of the whole battle. But be that what it may, he reflected, there is no riding around it now. I must look for the commander-in-chief here, and if all is lost, it is for me to perish with rest. The foreboding of evil that had suddenly come over Rostov was more and more confirmed the further he rode into the region behind the village of Pratzen, which was full of troops of all kinds. What does it mean? What is it? Whom are they firing at? Who is firing? Rostov kept asking as he came up to Russian and Austrian soldiers running in confused crowds along his path. The devil knows, they've killed everybody. It's all up now, he was told in Russian, German, and Czech by a crowd of fugitives who understood what was happening as little as he did. Kill the Germans, shouted one. May the devil take them, the traitors. Damn these Russians, muttered a German. Several wounded men passed along the road, and words of abuse, screams, and groans mingled in a general hubbub. Then the firing died down. Rostov learned later that Russian and Austrian soldiers had been firing at one another. My God, what does it all mean? Thought he. And here, where at any moment the emperor may see them, but no, these must be only a handful of scoundrels. It will soon be over. It can't be that. It can't be. Only to get past them quicker, quicker. The idea of defeat and flight could not enter Rostov's head. Though he saw French cannon and French troops on the Pratzen Heights, just where he had been ordered to look for the commander-in-chief, he could not, did not wish to, believe that. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 63. I'll now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 63. Assorted Impressions. Candide, the poor bastard, suffered a childhood of instruction in that most anti-empirical of all philosophies, optimism. Pangloss, his tutor, raised him to believe that in this best of all possible worlds the glass is always half full. What Candide did not know, but what he soon learned by means of progressively worse exposures to the horrors of the world, is that the glass is indeed half full of strychnine. Nicholas Rostov undergoes a similar journey in today's chapter. Things start out great for him. His squadron is nowhere near the battle. Prince Bagration wishes to preserve this state of affairs and avoid the responsibility of committing his troops to combat. He ignores Dolgorukov's pleas to commence engagement, and instead sends someone to inquire of Kutuzov what should be done next. He chooses Rostov for this task. Tolstoy writes that Rostov is happy to receive these orders because he's cheerful, bold, and resolute, with faith in his good fortune, and generally in that state of mind which makes everything seem possible, pleasant, and easy. Ah, Rostov, you Panglossian fool. So Rostov sets off, trotting along the lines towards his destination on the Pratzen Heights. At first things go swimmingly. There's nothing to worry about. But as he progresses, things get worse and worse. He soon comes across a cavalry unit preparing for battle. Then he starts to hear random cannon and musketry fire. As he continues, the firing increases in rapidity until it reaches such a pitch that it all combines into one giant roar of warfare. He even gets caught up in a semi-comedic encounter with the charging Russian horse guards. Then he runs into his old friends, Boris and Berg. Boris is crazed with the adrenaline rush of first battle. Berg is happy to wave his injured hand at Rostov, joyous that he has now earned the rights to knighthood, as have all his ancestors before him. Rostov continues on. When he finally approaches his destination, he looks on in horror as he realizes that the very place where he had been sent to inquire of Kutuzov is where the thick of battle is. It's a total mess, a place of massacre. But he has his orders. He continues on. You'll notice a change in Rostov in this chapter. The last time he was exposed to battle, he acted the coward and retreated. This time, however, he soldiers on, intent on performing his duty. He's taking the first steps towards being a better man and overcoming his fears. He's learning, just as Candide did, how to live in this worst of all possible worlds. It can be tough, so we have to be tougher, exercising our minds constantly to grapple with events that initially seem unbearable. Daily meditation. If you set these thoughts against your impression, you will overpower it and not be swept away by it. But, in the first place, do not allow yourself to be carried away by its intensity, but say, "Impression, wait for me a little. Let me see what you are and what you represent. Let me test you." Then, afterwards, do not allow it to draw you on by picturing what may come next, for if you do, it will lead you wherever it pleases. But rather, you should introduce some fair and noble impression to replace it, and banish this base and sordid one. If you become habituated to this kind of exercise, you will see what shoulders, what sinews, and what vigor you will come to have. But now you have mere trifling talk and nothing more. The man who is truly in training is the one who exercises himself to confront such impressions. Epictetus, The Discourses. All right, thanks so much for joining me today. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. Links to all that are below. Your support is greatly appreciated. Tomorrow, we'll be reading and reflecting on Chapter 64. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and of others.